Reading the Times for Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. Like Europe in medieval times, virus slows China's economy. More than 2 weeks after China locked down a major city to stop a dangerous viral outbreak, one of the world's largest economies remains largely idle. On Monday, Nissan of Japan said it would shut down its plant in Kyushu, Japan, for 4 days beginning later this week due to supply shortages of parts from China. Other car makers like FCA in Italy and Hyundai in South Korea have already warned that lack of parts in China could force them to curtail production in their home markets. Ford Motors said its joint ventures with one of China's biggest state-owned firms was restarting some production, but that it would ramp up our production over the following week. Trump's $4.8 trillion budget would cut safety net programs and boost defense. President Trump released a $4.8 trillion budget proposal on Monday that includes a familiar list of deep cuts to student loan assistance, affordable housing efforts, food stamps, and Medicaid, reflecting Trump's election year effort to continue shrinking the federal safety net. We're going to have a very good budget, a very powerful military budget, because we have no choice, he said, adding that he was aiming to reduce spending by rooting out fraud and abuse. The budget did contain a few initiatives compared to past budgets. Elizabeth Warren is running her race. The real one may be passing her by. Ria Olmsted, 71, a Bostonian who traveled to see Miss Warren in Manchester, was one of the many women to invoke the sting of Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016, suggesting that Miss Warren's campaign had been a kind of balm for hope-seeking women in the Trump age. Their case, there's no front-runner with an overpowering coalition, and Michael R. Bloomberg, the billionaire former New York mayor, will provide a useful foil for Miss Warren's familiar crusade against big money once he begins competing in states next month. According to a memo from her campaign manager last month, Miss Warren had more than 1,000 staff members on the ground in more than 30 states. Cruise ship's coronavirus outbreak leaves crew nowhere to hide. There are 132 Indians among the crew of more than 1,000. The ship is like a small city, Mr. Sarkar said in a Facebook chat, making it very easy to spread the virus. Similar to the situation in Wuhan, but at a smaller scale. By quarantining the ship, the crew members are being forced to stay together, which increases the likelihood of transmission, said John B. Lynch, an associate professor of infectious diseases at the University of Washington. In Hong Kong, where another cruise ship, the World Dream, has been held at port, about 1,800 crew members aboard were tested for the coronavirus after the authorities said the infected passengers had disembarked on January 24th in Guangzhou province, China. Shooting of man in face by ICE turns into a Trump-New York fight. Last month at a news conference in the city, Matthew T. Albence, ICE's acting director, blamed New York's sanctuary policies for the rape and murder of a 92-year-old woman in Queens. ICE said in a statement that the shot had been fired after its officers were physically attacked. 2 officers, including the one who fired his weapon, were treated for minor injuries, according to ICE, which also said its Office of Professional Responsibility was investigating the shooting. Protesters were still outside the hospital Maimonides Medical Center the next day when Mr. Avendano was picked up by ICE and taken to a New Jersey detention center. U.S. charges Chinese military officers in 2017 Equifax hacking. The Justice Department announced charges on Monday against 4 members of China's military on suspicion of hacking into Equifax, one of the nation's largest credit reporting agencies, in 2017, and stealing trade secrets and personal data of about 145 million Americans. Hackers stole names, birth dates, and social security numbers of millions of Americans, data that can be used to access information like medical histories and bank accounts. The Justice Department rarely secures indictments against members of foreign militaries or intelligence services, in part to avoid retaliation against American troops and spies. But Mr. Barr said it had made exceptions for state-sponsored actors who hacked into American networks to steal intellectual property or interfere in United States elections. Thai soldier in mass shooting had business clash with his commander. Sergeant Major Jakrapanth, called Jack by his friends, grew up in one of Thailand's poorest regions, and on graduating from high school, he enrolled in a military academy for non-commissioned officers. Sergeant Major Jakrapanth began the rampage by killing his superior officer and his mother-in-law. In a slow-moving motorcade, relatives, army officers, and police officials delivered the coffins of 2 police special forces officers to the airport. Storm Ciara, or Sabine, leaves 5 dead in Europe. Storm Ciara, or Sabine as the storm is called in German-speaking countries, tore through Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, unleashing chaos and killing at least 5 people, according to reports from news agencies and social media. Stephen Keats, a senior meteorologist in Britain's Met Office, his country's National Meteorological Service, said on Monday that though the storms are common in winter, Storm Ciara is notable because of the very strong and widespread winds. Uwe Kirschke of the German Weather Service said on Monday that the worst had passed, but storm warnings were still active in Bavaria, where 50,000 houses did not have power because of the storm. Killing of terrorist leader in Yemen is latest blow to Qaeda affiliate. The White House's announcement last week that the United States had killed the group's leader, Qasim al-Rani, confirming what the New York Times first reported several days earlier, was the latest in a string of setbacks over the past few years that have damaged the group's ability to orchestrate or carry out operations against the West, American and European counterterrorism specialists say. Clashes with rival Islamic State and Houthi rebel fighters in Yemen have also weakened the group, whose full name is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. At a news conference last month, the FBI Deputy Director David Bowditch said that while Lieutenant al-Shamrani did not appear to be motivated by one specific terrorist group, his social media comments echoed those of Anwar al-Awlaki, the radical Yemeni American cleric and senior leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who was killed in a drone strike in 2011. AQAP remains a significant lingering concern in part. AQAP remains a significant lingering concern in part because the group was so fixated on aviation as a target, and the kind of bomb-making expertise that the group developed was unlikely to have been contained to a few select individuals, said Nicholas J. Rasmussen, a former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Merkel's chosen successor steps aside. The far right cries victoire. The vote defied Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer, national leader of the Christian Democrats, and exposed her lack of authority over her center-right party. For now, the party is seriously divided between its more conservative members who want to join forces with the far right, and those like Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer, who want to draw a red line against any collaboration. Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer, who will remain defense minister, was chosen as the leader of Ms. Merkel's Conservative Party in December 2018 and has been widely expected to succeed her as chancellor. Russia scientist anti-fascist on bogus terrorist charges, critics say. A Russian military court on Monday handed down harsh sentences of up to 18 years to 7 members of a group of left-wing activists, who in turn accused the authorities of extorting confessions through torture and threats against their families. At least 4 of them initially pleaded guilty, but later switched, contending that their original pleas had been obtained under torture. and that there are no such terror group, and that prosecutors had invented the name The Network in testimony during a court hearing in May. Dmitry Cherlenstev, who the authorities said the group's leader, described how the torture sessions were conducted. Africa, a thunder and lightning hotspot, may even see some storms. There's no organized data for lightning casualties that covers all of Africa, but a 2018 study of 8 countries put the number of deaths at about 500 per year. Global data on an economic impact of thunderstorms is patchy, but a 2008 assessment by the National Lightning Safety Institute in Louisville, Colorado, placed the annual cost in the United States at $5 billion to $6 billion. Because of data limitations and differing methodologies, there's no consensus, for now at least, on how climate change will affect thunderstorms, or whether more thunderstorms will necessarily mean more lightning strikes. Philippines moves to shut ABS-CBN, its leading broadcast network. The Philippine Solicitor General Jose Calida lodged a complaint with the country's high court, accusing ABS-CBN Corp and its subsidiary ABS-CBN Convergence of violating the operating franchise it was granted by Congress, which is set to expire in March. ABS-CBN, along with the Filipino online news site Rappler, have been at the forefront of critical reporting about the anti-drug campaign, which has left nearly 6,000 people dead since Mr. Duterte took office in 2016. Mr. Kalita said the government will prove that ABS-CBN had been broadcasting for a fee, which is beyond the scope of its legislative franchise. He also accused the company of hiding behind what he said was an elaborately crafted corporate veil by allowing foreign investors to take part in its ownership. Richard Javad Heydarian, a political scientist and author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy, said that while the government move was expected, time is on ABS-CBN's side because Mr. Duterte is already in the second half of his 6-year term. Canadian police move against pipeline blockades, arresting dozens. The Canadian police on Monday began moving arrests against protesters who had set up transportation blockades around the country in sympathy with an Indigenous group's campaign to halt the construction of natural gas pipeline to Canada's west coast. The protests were in support of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, some of whose members are opposed to the construction of a 416-mile, $6.2 billion Canadian dollar project to link gas wells in the interior of British Columbia to a new liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast where exports sail to Asia. The protest began after the Royal Canadian Mounted Police moved last week to enforce an injunction granted on December 31st against the Wet'suwet'en, who have been blocking the roads at the construction site. Let's not shake hands. Xi Jinping tours Beijing amid coronavirus crises. Mr. Xi's appearance kicked off an unusual unannounced blitz around Beijing on the day the city was supposed to return to work after a prolonged holiday break, but did not. The temperature checks that Mr. Xi had to endure at the community center and again at the hospital have become a recurring experience for millions of Chinese entering practically any public space, from the subway to shopping centers. Wu Qiang, an independent political analyst in Beijing, said the worsening epidemic had created pressure from the public and inside the party for Mr. Xi to show that he was, as often reported, personally directing the government's response. UK declares coronavirus imminent threat as Europe scrambles. Britain's health department declared the new coronavirus an imminent threat to public health and announced a series of measures to combat the spread of the virus, a sign of the seriousness with which local health authorities are treating the fears of the epidemic. The newly introduced measures, which apply only in England, are among the first in Europe to allow the health authorities to keep individuals in quarantine if public health professionals believe they may be at risk of spreading the virus. The Department of Health and Social Care emphasized that the risk of contracting the coronavirus in Britain remains moderate, even as the government empowered the health authorities to forcibly quarantine people. Lessons that go beyond the coronavirus outbreak. There are more than 40,000 cases, with more than 900 deaths linked to it. Eventually, we won't worry about it anymore, then we'll worry about which virus is causing our latest cold. More than a third of the people infected with the coronavirus don't even notice they're ill. A job overseas but stranded by coronavirus travel bans. Jade Duringo arrived at Manila's international airport more than 5 hours ahead of her scheduled departure to Hong Kong, where she worked as a software engineer. Around her, domestic workers called their employers in Hong Kong, their voices rising in panic. Miss Duringo still isn't sure whether she'll be able to return to Hong Kong. More than 100 troops had brain injuries from Iran missile strike, Pentagon says. As the injury toll has mounted, veterans groups and others have levied criticism at the White House, in part because in January, President Trump dismissed the injuries as not very serious. Days after Mr. Trump's statement in Davos, the Defense Department said 34 people had suffered brain injuries. Traumatic brain injuries can result from powerful changes in atmospheric pressure and accompanying an explosion like that of a missile warhead. Only in the last several years has the Pentagon made a considerable effort to understand the injuries. Coronavirus outbreak risks reviving stigma for China. There is quite a fair amount of epidemics originating in China or passing through China, she said. While the virus does not sicken humans and did not originate in China, critics say Chinese government policies and mismanagement may have inadvertently helped the epidemic accelerate through the country's pig population, the world's largest, and spread elsewhere in Asia. As of Monday, the new coronavirus, traced to a living animal market in the central Chinese city of Wuhan, has killed 908 people and infected more than 40,000 in China and 24 other countries and territories. Why might China be at special risk for zoonotic infection? Many epidemiologists point to some fundamental facts about China: its population of 1.4 billion people, the proximity of urban and rural dwellers, as well as the slaughterhouses and urban markets, where animals are freshly butchered. Pangolins are suspected as a potential coronavirus host. Further complicating matters, animals at the Wuhan market seem to have been quickly disposed of, although reports from China were that samples of those animals tested negative for the virus. Palm civets turned out to be an intermediate host of SARS, and camels an intermediate host of MERS. In both outbreaks, the researchers eventually found that the origin of the virus was in bats, where the virus could live without sickening the animal. On Friday, the Xinhua news agency reported that researchers at South China Agriculture University had found a virus in pangolins that had a 99% match to the novel coronavirus that has now sickened 40,000 people and killed more than 900. Meet the Latinos trying to get Latinos to the polls. Finding a way to redefine what it means to be Latino is at the core of Mr. J. Green's work. It's how we continue to make space for the Latino movement to be a part of the campaign, but also for the campaign to show up to the movement, he said. National Latino Engagement Director for former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., Laura Jimenez, has been listening to a lot of Juan Luis Guerra lately. Louisiana man pleads guilty to burning down 3 black churches. Mr. Matthews, an aficionado black metal subgenre of heavy metal, said he was copying similar crimes committed in Norway in the 1990s as an attempt to elevate his status among the black metal community, whose most extreme practitioners engaged in church burnings, vandalism, and killings. Mr. Matthews set fire to St. Mary Baptist Church in Port Barre, Louisiana, on March 26th, Greater Union Baptist Church in Opelousas on April 2nd, and Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, also in Opelousas, on April 4th. All fires took place in the middle of the night and did not injure anyone. David C. Joseph, the United States Attorney for Louisiana's Western District, said in a statement, "Today, the defendant has taken responsibility for the burn-ins and the destruction of 3 of our churches. The freedom to safely congregate and worship in our churches is a fundamental right of all Americans and will be vigorously protected by my office and our law enforcement partners." Oh, does another state also vote early? New Hampshire isn't listening. New Hampshire voters are known for their steely New England independence and eagerness to buck whatever those Midwesterners do with their votes. The New Hampshire primary electorate tends to be a little less ideologically liberal in Democratic races. More than 40% of New Hampshire voters are independent, a significantly greater share than either party can claim, and independents are allowed to participate in either primary. Dante J. Scala, professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire, says the idea of New Hampshire as a fiercely countervailing force is more political lore than fact, at least when it comes to Democratic primaries. Biden braces for a rough New Hampshire vote, setting expectations low. As New Hampshire votes on Tuesday, its presidential primary, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. is confronting the possibility of a fourth or even fifth finish, an outcome that could present existential political and financial threats to his once poll-topping presidential campaign and upend his bet on dominating later voting. More diverse states like South Carolina. At a breakfast with reporters on Monday hosted by Bloomberg News, Kate Bedingfield, a deputy campaign manager of Mr. Biden's team, said, "We're absolutely going to have the resources that we need to compete on Super Tuesday." She said she believed that Mr. Biden's perceived firewall in South Carolina would hold regardless of New Hampshire's primary results, pointing to his deep relations with black Democrats there. Mr. Biden has kept up the hunt for votes in New Hampshire in the final days before the primary. New Hampshire usually winnows the field. This year it might be different. With the extraordinary possibility of 5 leading candidates surviving beyond New Hampshire and 2 self-funded billionaires awaiting them in later states, the contest appeared more unsettled than ever on the eve of a primary that usually ends presidential aspirations. With the recent polls here showing Mr. Sanders and Mr. Buttigieg ahead of the field and the 3 leading rivals jostling for third place, with a still undecided electorate, the top candidates each began to make plans for 2 more diverse states, Nevada and South Carolina, as well as next month's Super Tuesday, believing the rivals to be fatally flawed. As candidates made their final push across New Hampshire on Monday, they sought to sharpen the distinctions with one another, especially Mr. Buttigieg and Mr. Sanders. Sanders and Buttigieg close out New Hampshire, pitching different visions. Over the weekend, Mr. Sanders laced into Mr. Buttigieg for raising money from billionaires, including heads of large corporations, CEOs in the pharmaceutical industry, people from Wall Street. Pete seems to think that it doesn't matter in his case. He raised lots and lots of money from at least 40 billionaires. Mr. Sanders said in an afternoon event for supporters in Salem at a coffee shop that features a Sanders presidential blend. Mr. Buttigieg's aides, too, frequently join a chorus of criticism of Mr. Sanders, pushing videos on Twitter on Monday morning featuring Mr. Sanders dodging a question about the cost of his health care plan. Andrew Yang's campaign is riding on New Hampshire. For months, the entrepreneur Andrew Yang has been dutifully reminding New Hampshire voters they went to high school at Phillips Exeter Academy. After the campaign laid off its staff members, it sent an email to supporters signed by Mr. Yang that suggested he would need to finish in the top 4 here for his campaign to get the boost it needs. And in the still crowded field, a finish would that high would almost likely certainly require Mr. Yang to significantly outperform his poll numbers. Put it another way, Devin Clemens, 23 of Milford, New Hampshire, said Mr. Yang would need to shock the political world. What would that entail exactly? Several of Mr. Yang's supporters, including Mr. Clemens, said they thought he needed to finish with support in the double digits. Prosecutors recommend Roger Stone receive up to 9 years in prison. Federal prosecutors asked a judge on Monday to sentence Roger J. Stone, Jr., President Trump's longtime friend and former campaign advisor, for up to 9 years in prison for lying to Congress and tampering with a witness to prevent investigators from discovering how the 2016 Trump campaign tried to benefit from stolen Democratic documents. In their own memorandum, Mr. Stone's lawyer argued that the prosecutors had misconstrued harmless messages from Mr. Stone to the witness, a New York radio host named Randy Credico, as genuine threats. The prosecutors' request that Mr. Stone be imprisoned contrasted sharply with the recent plea for leniency in the case of Rick Gates. Mr. Trump's former deputy campaign chairman, who also helped manage his inauguration. Mitt Romney is a Judas to many Republicans, but not in Utah. Within hours of Senator Mitt Romney's vote to remove President Trump from office on Wednesday, Mr. Lyman, a freshman state representative from southern Utah, who keeps an autographed Make America Great Again hat in a plexiglass case in his office, was at work drafting a resolution to censure the senator. Censuring Senator Romney for voting his conscience is a tricky place to be, the Speaker of the State House, Brad Wilson, said in an interview. Last week, national conservative activists promoted a Recall Romney effort online and shared stories about proposal circulating in the legislature that aim to give voters the ability to recall their United States senators. Some experts worry that as a germphobic Trump confronts a growing epidemic. Many health experts call Mr. Trump's response as extreme, noting that health workers would most likely face agonizing deaths had they not been evacuated to American hospitals. While Mr. Trump has so far kept his distance from the issues, public health experts worry that his extreme fear of germs, disdain for scientific and bureaucratic expertise, and suspicion of foreigners could be a dangerous mix should he wind up overseeing a severe outbreak at home. Some health experts worry that Mr. Trump overpromised because the order which the White House announced abruptly with little outside consultation is unlikely to prevent the illness from reaching the United States, and federal health officials say they assume the number of cases in the United States is likely to increase. Chief Justice's impeachment handbook, determined minimalism. At the impeachment trial, the Chief Justice read senators' questions passed to him on note cards. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts and a 2020 presidential candidate, had the Chief Justice recite this one. At a time when large majorities of Americans have lost faith in government, does the fact that the Chief Justice is presiding over an impeachment trial, which Republican senators have thus far refused to allow witnesses or evidence, contribute to a loss of legitimacy of the Chief Justice, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution? The trial may be over, but Mr. Trump's policies and personal affairs will continue to occupy the Chief Justice and his court. Trump lashes out at Manchin, and he pushes back. Senator Joe Manchin III votes with President Trump more than any other Democrat in the Senate. In the days since Mr. Manchin, a West Virginian who is one of the few swing voters on impeachment, supported Mr. Trump's removal, the president has laced into the senator with a zeal that is startling even by his standards. Given the politics of West Virginia, a state Mr. Trump won with 68% of the vote in 2016, Mr. Manchin was among a very small group of Democrats who were seen as possible votes to acquit. New campaign sexual misconduct rules will tackle dating violence. The department is aligning its regulations with definitions already established in the 1990 Clery Act, which requires colleges to regularly report security issues and criminal acts, and protections outlined in the 1994 Violence Against Women's Act. But the department will also bring the weight of civil rights enforcement to every school in the country, where episodes of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, collectively known as intimate partner violence, have increased in recent years. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that nearly 1 in 11 females and about 1 in 15 male high school students reported experiencing physical dating violence, and 1 in 9 females and 1 in 36 male high school students reported experiencing sexual dating violence. A 2017 study by Ball State University of school responses to teenage dating violence found that more than half of the 750 high school principals surveyed said they had encountered a victim of dating violence. Justice Department sues over sanctuary laws in California, New Jersey, and Seattle. In 2018, the Justice Department sued California over 3 state laws, accusing state officials of making it impossible for federal immigration officials to deport criminals born outside the United States. Despite the setback in the courts, the Justice Department on Monday again sued California Governor Gavin Newsom and the State Attorney General Xavier Becerra over a state law that said it interfered with the work of federal government authorities. Jenny Durkin, the mayor of Seattle and a former United States attorney in Washington state pushed back on the new lawsuits. Justice Department will accept material from Giuliani, but Barr voices caution. Mr. Barr's remarks came a day after Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, said the Attorney General had informed him that the Justice Department was receiving information coming out of Ukraine that Mr. Giuliani and his associates were uncovering. Mr. Giuliani would not comment Monday on whether he had shared any information with the Justice Department, but he rejected questions about the credibility of what he collected. A spokesman said that Brian A. Benkowski, an assistant attorney general for the department's criminal division, would not have included Mr. Giuliani in an August meeting about a bribery case had he known the federal prosecutors in New York were investigating two of Mr. Giuliani's associates, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. Why some black Puerto Ricans choose white on the census. All residents of Puerto Rico can select yes Puerto Rican on the census to indicate their Hispanic origin. The Trump administration's slow responses after Hurricane Maria and other natural disasters have made many Puerto Ricans reconsider their decision to identify as white Americans, said Kimberly Figueroa Calderon, a member of Colectivo Yet, a coalition of Puerto Rican educators and organizers who are campaigning for more Puerto Ricans to identify as black on the 2020 census. The practice of reclassifying people's race continued after the United States seized Puerto Rico in 1898. Before the 1960s, census takers in the United States and Puerto Rico decided people's race for them and applied whiteness liberally on the island, sometimes reclassifying people from black to white. A twist in California's homeless crisis. Evictions by the evicted. Believe me, we see the irony, said Mr. Hebring, whose job it is to deliver eviction notices with his girlfriend, Kim Hansen. For Miss Hansen, it was a combination of a fractured family, a mother who got hooked on methamphetamines, and natural disasters. Twice Miss Hansen had her home burned down in wildfires. In a soaking rain, we walked to a FedEx shop in Oakland, where the store manager downloaded and printed the documents for $1.37. Since they accepted their first freelance gig for legal service companies in September, Mr. Hebring and Miss Hansen have delivered dozens of documents. Chinese hacking is alarming. So are data brokers. The Equifax data we know was stolen is a perfect example of what's known as personally identifiable information. Equifax amasses personal data on millions of Americans whether we want it to or not, creating valuable profiles that can be used to approve or deny loans or insurance claims. Equifax's services as a data broker offer something similar to its customers, promising data and insights it can leverage for corporate power. How Trump got trickled down. Trump's only major legislative achievement, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, was absolutely standard modern republicanism. Huge tax cuts for corporations, plus tax breaks that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy. Why has Trump turned out to be such a conventional Republican? My sense is he doesn't really care about policy aside from protectionism, which I'll get to in a minute, while establishment Republicans headed off to any important change in NAFTA, which would have been really bad for business. Trump's basically took the existing agreement and stuck his name on it. They have been willing to indulge his posturing on other, less critical fronts. Class war at the Oscar. On Sunday night, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite morphed from a merely great film into a history-making phenomenon, becoming the first foreign-language film to win the Oscar for Best Picture. Parasite depicts a world where a chasm divides the rich who live in an airy minimalist splendor and the poor who exist to a degree that becomes increasingly macabre as the film progresses. Literally underground, Parasite isn't even the most Marxist-seeming film. The urgent question scientists are asking about the coronavirus. The infected people unknowingly spread it to others, setting off the outbreak's deadly journey. Out of view is some proportion of mildly infected people with minor symptoms or no symptoms, who no one knows are infected. In other recent study, we examined how many people could get infected if there were no drastic public health interventions. Why Bernie Sanders praised Amazon. While we fully agree that a company of Amazon's size should be scrutinized, we also believe people should know that Amazon is doing exactly what many lawmakers and critics insist that private sector should do. While the debate about Amazon's impact at times focuses on how our hourly jobs compare with jobs of the past, or to an idealized vision of the future, the truth is that more than 40 million Americans earn less than the lowest paid Amazon associate. Once again, the scale of Amazon's investment in its own workforce will influence other major companies to follow suit. As Democrats try to move on from the caucus chaos. Imagine if starting now the Bernie bros changed the script and pledged to make 2020 a different election than 2016 by committing to put all of the force behind whichever candidate fairly wins the nomination. Imagine if Bernie then transformed our fractured party into one inclusive big tent, a tent full of passionate voters who could decisively beat President Trump. Michelle Goldberg blames Joe Biden for the chaos. President Trump clearly went after Mr. Biden because he knows the former vice president is a candidate best positioned to beat him. Trump's reprisals, firing witnesses, punishing New York. Thank you, President Trump, Thank you, Mr. President, for making the case so clearly and powerfully. President Trump's targeting of New York State for retribution for a new law allowing undocumented immigrants to obtain driver's licenses points up yet another drawback to the Electoral College system. It makes no difference to Mr. Trump if this action, barring New Yorkers from trusted traveler programs, cost him votes in New York, which is in the Democrats' pocket for November. A beloved philanthropist, a grisly murder, and a neighborhood in shock. 1 week later, on January 28th, the police arrested Dondre Richardson, 33, a homeless man who authorities say had been living in a shelter on Ward's Island, who may have had a sexual relationship with Mr. Lippman. As Mr. Richardson was escorted out of Brooklyn's 88th precinct on the night of January 30th, he told media that Mr. Lippman was his friend. Others still question how Mr. Lippman could have become entangled with someone like Mr. Richardson. Man who shot up Bronx precinct was tired of police officers. A prosecutor, Barim Namani, said Mr. Williams had told investigators in videotaped interviews he carried out the attacks because he was tired of police officers. Later, Mr. Namani said Mr. Williams told officers at a hospital he would shoot them once he was released. Police officers eventually used a stun gun to subdue him. Ms. Williams said, 4 days later at around 8 p.m. on Saturday, the police said Mr. Williams approached a parked police van in Hunts Point and asked two officers for directions. Weinstein accuser called him her spiritual soulmate, witness says. A former friend of Jessica Mann, a key accuser in the Harvey Weinstein rape trial, said on the stand that Miss Mann had described Mr. Weinstein as her spiritual soulmate, and she never said he raped her. The friend, Talita Amaya, testified on Monday as a witness for the defense in an effort to discredit Miss Mann's testimony that Mr. Weinstein, the famous Hollywood producer, attacked her at a hotel in Manhattan in 2013. A second woman, Claudia Salinas, took the stand in the defense, denying allegations that in 2012 she had helped trap a model and aspiring actress, Lauren Young, in Los Angeles hotel bathroom, where Mr. Weinstein allegedly assaulted her. Miss Maya said Miss Mann placed her arm around Mr. Weinstein, pinched his cheek, and said, "No, it's because he's so cute." Miss Maya said Mr. Weinstein and Miss Mann then walked off to a secluded area. Sorry, renters, you still have to pay broker's fee for now. A New York State judge on Monday temporarily blocked the state's week-old ruling that had effectively barred tenants from having to pay a broker fee, issuing at least a short-term reprieve to an industry scrambling to respond. Real estate groups in their suits argued on the ban for broker fees never came up last year as a part of a sweeping rent laws adopted by the state legislature, and the Department of State was effectively imposing a new rule without giving the industry a chance to weigh in. The Department of State issued the ruling last Tuesday and addressed a slew of outstanding questions about last year's landmark rent laws in New York State. Your foam coffee cup is fighting for its life. The Dart Container Corporation, which makes foam products, is manufacturing behemoth and produce a fortune for the family behind it. So Dart offered to collect and transport the used foam containers for cities at no cost. Foam food containers cannot be turned into new containers because health regulators have not approved them for such use. Dart says. Judge is said to rule for T-Mobile merger with Sprint. The judge in a contentious lawsuit that tried to stop the long-in-the-works merger between T-Mobile and Sprint is planning to rule in favor of the deal, according to 3 people briefed on the matter. The state argued that the combination of T-Mobile and Sprint would reduce competition in the telecommunications industry, leading to higher cell phone bills and place a financial burden on lower-income customers. To get the nod from the government, T-Mobile and Sprint agreed to sell off significant portions of their businesses to the paid television operator Dish Network, as a part of a plan to create a potential new major wireless company. From Starbucks to FedEx, coronavirus upends businesses that depend on China. Now the virus is forcing companies to restrict travel to China or temporarily shut stores, office, restaurants, and theme parks. The company's chief executive said it wasn't changing its financial guidance for 2020. Over the last couple of weeks, a series of major airlines have canceled flights to China, including Delta, United, and American. Burberry warned investors that the outbreak was having a material negative effect on luxury demands. 24 of its 64 stores in mainland China are closed, and those that remain open with reduced operating hours have fewer shoppers than usual, the company said. Trump's budget math grapples with economic reality. In its fiscal year 2011 budget, for example, the Obama administration predicted several years of growth, topping 4% in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, a number it never came close to reaching even once. Trump officials have considered their projections to be breaking from that trend. Writing last year, they were the first administration on record to have experienced economic growth that meets or exceeds its own forecast in each of its first 2 years in office. That turned out to be wrong. In the middle of last year, the Commerce Department revised its counting of the 2018 growth rate downward to well below the rate Trump's officials had forecasted. Mr. Trump's first budget in the spring of 2017 predicted growth of 2.3% that year using the administration's preferred measure, the change in the size of the economy from the fourth quarter of the preceding year. White House earmarks new money for AI and quantum computing. For several years, technologists have urged the Trump administration to back research on artificial intelligence, which could affect things as diverse as weapons and transportation, and quantum computing, a new way to build superpower computers. In 2018, President Trump signed a law that earmarked $1.2 billion for quantum research. The new budget proposal would increase funding for artificial intelligence research at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a research arm of the Defense Department, to $249 million from $50 million. And the National Science Foundation to $850 million from about $500 million. Amazon looks to question Trump in Pentagon contracting case. Amazon challenged the decision in December, claiming that Mr. Trump used improper pressure on the Pentagon to prevent Amazon from winning the contract as a part of an attempt to harm the company's chief executive, Jeff Bezos. In its new motion, Amazon calls Mr. Trump's animosity for Mr. Bezos a matter of public record. It cited Mr. Trump's Twitter post and other public comments. Amazon's legal filing documents Mr. Trump's general animus towards Mr. Bezos and his interest in Jedi, but it does not provide direct evidence that Mr. Trump ordered Mr. Esper to award the contract to a competitor, or that Mr. Esper followed such orders. The Trump budget would fray social safety net. President Trump, since his 2016 campaign, has broken with other Republicans to promise to protect America's most prominent social safety net programs. But his budget request for the fiscal year 2021 would trim government programs that millions of Americans depend upon. Overall, Mr. Trump estimates that overhauling federal disability programs and addressing fraud would save more than $75 billion between 2021 and 2030. The White House also wants to take a knife to the federal food stamp program, once again calling for reductions in the number of adults who can qualify for the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP. The 2021 budget proposes cutting SNAP funds by about $15 billion from last year. We must remember, compassion is not always how many people we can get on a government program, Mr. Carson said, but rather how many people we can help graduate out of a program and into financial independence. Trump budget calls for new nuclear warheads and 2 types of missiles. In the 2021 budget released Monday, the administration revealed for the first time that it intended to create a new submarine-launched nuclear warhead, named the W-93. Its development is part of a proposed 19% increase this year to $19.8 billion for the National Nuclear Security Administration, the Energy Department agency that maintains a nuclear stockpile and develops new nuclear warheads. Another new nuclear warhead called the 87-1, a redesign of a 40-year-old thermonuclear weapon made for ground-based missiles, will not begin production until 2030. The bottom line is that NNSA has more work on its plate than it can perform. Mr. Young said of the National Nuclear Security Administration, doing nothing while waiting for a better agreement is a recipe for disaster. We could lose the new START and fail to replace it. The treaty's agreed limits on nuclear arsenals are too important to be put at risk in the game of a nuclear chicken. What is President Trump's fiscal 2021 budget? The budget specifies changes that would tend to reduce enrollment in Medicaid, and the Congressional Budget Office has estimated would cause some states to reverse their expansions of coverage to childless adults without disabilities as a part of the Affordable Care Act. The administration once again suggested cutting funding for Americans' primary food assistance program and continued an effort to reduce the number of adults who qualify for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. The budget reduced SNAP funding by almost $180 billion between 2021 and 2030. White House has been making changes to the program on its own, including toughening eligibility requirements and cracking down on states that misuse worker requirement waivers. The current budget for the FDA Tobacco Center is $662 million, and the president budget is asking for an additional $100 million. Federal bill seeks to make companies responsible for plastic waste. The bill being introduced by Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico and Representative Alan Lowenthal of California is one of the most aggressive sweeping attempts to hold the plastic industry, beverage makers, and other companies financially responsible for dealing with the waste they create. Most of the legislative efforts to battle plastic waste have been played out at the state and local levels, where officials have voted to ban products such as plastics, bags, and polystyrene foam food containers. Even these measures have taken hold in some places. Beverage companies and plastic lobbyists have successfully beaten back other initiatives like bottle bills, in large part because of the cost they would impose on the industry. Puerto Rico reaches deal to settle $35 billion in debt. Puerto Rico has researched a deal with creditors who hold $35 billion in its general obligations bond, passing an important milestone as it tries to resolve its $129 billion debt crisis. The deal still requires the approval of Puerto Rico's legislature, but it would provide for holders of the island's general obligations bonds to exchange them for a combination of cash and new debt. The new debt would be an even split of general obligation bonds and new bonds backed by Puerto Rico's sales tax, a more attractive option than the old proposal, which included only general obligation bonds. And that has been a reading the Times for February 11th, 2020.